Hi, this is Steve Hargadon, and welcome to the Future of Education. It's Thursday, March 7th, 2013, and our special guest is Chris Mercogliano. There I go. Hi, Chris.
Nicely done. Pretty good for an Irish.
Poorly done, but you're gonna let me pass, I'm sure.
Well, you're Irish. You got to pass. Come on now.
The Future of Education is a Web 2.0 Labs project, thanks to Mighty Bell, Menko, and Blackboard Collaborate for support. If you go to web20labs.com, you can see all of the fun activities we have coming up this year. Several virtual conferences. These are free events, worldwide events that are all sort of peer learning based, especially for educators. On March 28th, we have our School Leadership Summit, which is shaping up just beautifully. That's an all-day event for school leaders to present to each other. If you're going to be at the ISTE show, don't miss ISTE Unplugged, our set of crowdsourced activities, including the all-day Unconference, which this year is called Hack Education, with co-chair Audrey Waters. We do have the Worldwide STEM Conference coming up, the Future of Libraries Conference, the Global Education Conference, and many more that we're in planning stages on. Coming up on the show next week, Paul Thomas talks about poverty and the corporate takeover of education. Edith Harrell Caperton is going to talk about constructivist learning. She actually published the book with Seymour Papert. Some of you are going to know her. On the 14th is our first virtual book club meeting on Seymour's Mindstorms book. This should be a lot of fun. If you're interested, go to bookclub20.com and you'll find more information on that particular event. Jay Cross then talks to us about informal learning. You can see the rest of the schedule there. I won't read through it all, but lots of fun coming up. If you've missed any of the shows, they are all recorded. There's a particularly bad recording, I apologize for this, of the show with Richie Norton on the power of starting something stupid. Somehow his audio interfered with mine. He sounds great. I sound terrible. You can ignore me. The recording is well worth listening to just to hear him. But do get past the first few minutes where you may be fearful that it's going to be terrible. This is a chance for those of you in our studio audience to indicate where you're listening from. So look for the icons to the left of the map. You're looking for the star icon. Double click on that and then click on the map. Feel free to shout out in the chat as well. A little bit of geographic diversity. It's always fun. And you can keep doing that or keep indicating in the chat and talking to each other while you move on. If the chat gets busy, it's often easiest to actually pull it out from that small container that it's in. So just double click at the click and hold at the top of that box and drag it out, and then you can resize it. Or you can look for the little menu that allows you to detach the panel, and you can go through that same resizing wherever you're coming in from, or if you're listening to the recording, we sure appreciate your taking the time to do so. There is a Mighty Bell space for this session. Mighty Bell is the content and curation project from Gina Bianchini, who is the co-founder of Ning. I do consult for Gina, so there's full disclosure there, but I've created a space for this interview. You can follow up, put resources there, talk to each other, and the like, and that's listed in the chat. It's also on the original blog post for the show. Chris, this was a really sort of profoundly moving book for me. I'm so glad to have gotten the chance to get to know you a little bit by reading it. Can you tell me what the subtitle means, Protecting Kids' Inner Wilderness?
No, it's inner wildness. But there's a link to wilderness, which that's all right. But I created that construct carefully and deliberately. You know, calling what I mean by inner wildness is children's inner spark. I just didn't want to use the word soul because it's been overused, and it's a loaded term in so many ways. Same with the word spirit. A lot of those words that refer to kind of our inner essence, that which makes us who we are, I didn't work. So I had to come up with something else. But in choosing the word inner wildness, I wanted to draw a parallel or a connection between inner wildness and outer wildness, as in wilderness. So you misspoke in a kind of in a good way, because you were picking up on my other meaning.
That's giving me more credit than I deserve. I just misread the word there. I had it written correctly. Well, you talk later in the book about the possible confusion with Lord of the Flies. That was actually sort of something I thought of too, as I just thought of the word wildness. I also thought of where the wild things live. But essentially, you're talking about this desire, an innate desire to sort of resist the control of others, right?
Well, that's part of what our essence does. I mean, we each of us has a very strong inner drive to be who we are, and I just believe that's the way it works. And I'm not alone. I mean, I've always believed this, I think, going back to my childhood, but certainly if you look at the ancient Greeks, they had the same idea. So I didn't invent the idea. It's an old idea. The ancient Greeks called this notion, that they just had the idea that every soul, we're all born with souls, each of us. And then the soul comes sort of accompanied by a guardian along with the soul. And the guardian's job is it's not quite the same idea as guardian angel. It's not about safety. It's not about protection. It's about keeping our souls on track so that we fulfill the purpose or purposes, with which we came into this life in the first place. So I'm getting pretty mystical and philosophical here at this point. But the Greeks were very clear about that idea. They called that guardian sort of spirit the daimon. And I just updated the word. I didn't want to use their word, so I created my own term and ended up calling it inner wildness.
Well, there is this sort of question that we have about the balance between our innate tendencies and culture, right? And Lord of the Flies is maybe not a bad way to kind of frame that discussion, because Lord of the Flies comes out of a certain cultural perception of what we would be like without civilizing influence. And it was really revealing to me to hear somebody who's had a lot of experience with children say, I don't agree with that. What would your criticism be, or how would you respond to Lord of the Flies?
Well, I think one of the most important things to realize is that the author of Lord of the Flies, William Golding, was the principal of a Church of England school, in more or less Victorian England. So he was dealing with an incredibly strong sort of Hobbesian cultural bias. Hobbes talked about life being nasty, brutish, and short. And the Puritans and the Puritans that came over, that fled England because they were too weird, to be in England, that came over here and settled in Connecticut and Massachusetts and so on. Those early Puritans and Calvinists who started the school system essentially in the United States in the 17th and then early 18th centuries. I mean, they literally believed that children were the devil's handiwork. I mean, that's a direct quote from some of those early church leaders in this country. So that's just where Golding was coming from. That was in his DNA. This prejudiced view towards children, and I just, that's not my experience. I spent 35 years teaching in a school where children had an immense amount of freedom. And we trusted in children's essential goodness. And we believe that children, and even young children, are sort of innately disposed, they're predisposed to be responsible, to be sociable, to want to do the right thing, to want to learn, to want to excel, and so on. And I can report after 35 years that it's really true. It's incredibly true. Children they're born essentially good. Things get in the way of that goodness. Things go wrong. Children don't get what they need as infants or as little children, and they become defensive. They become angry. They become unhappy, and their natural goodness, it gets blocked, certainly. But what we found in our school is that when we could help children, when children came to us and they weren't happy, we could work with them and work on what was causing their unhappiness, solve the problems, and then when they became happy, they were capable of completely being responsible, self-directing beings. And then, of course, plenty of kids would come to us, and they were already happy. They were the fortunate kids who had parents who nurtured them in the right amounts and in the right ways. And does that make sense?
It does, and we're going to get to dive into several aspects of that during the interview. I really am anxious to have you tell a little bit about the school. I want to talk about sort of how you kind of create that environment, maybe some of the tendencies that lead us toward being controlling instead of supportive. But before we get there, why this book at this time? Why are you sounding an alarm right now?
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. The very first sentence in the book is, childhood is in trouble. And it is. It's a long story. What I tried to accomplish in the book was to follow this thread. What's happening to childhood, from where I stand, is that it's coming, and children are coming under increasing degrees of control from the outside, from sort of every dimension of their lives. And then that's what I try to do in the book, is follow that thread of control from childbirth. Even my wife is a home birth midwife, so I have a very good window into the realm of childbirth and how childbirth works, and the way that the way the birth experience itself impacts a new life. And so I actually begin with birth, but then you follow that thread into early childhood and into parenting patterns, and then you follow it into school, and you follow it into society, and all of the ways in which modern society is sort of closing down on children and taking away the opportunities for them to be themselves, to explore, to have their own, I would say, wild experience that's not that they're creating themselves, their own authentic experience. It's really in so many ways disappearing, and then we're starting to notice. I mean, the book's been out several years, and I'm pleased to note that since I started writing the book, there's a much greater awareness of this problem, and people are starting to talk about it. And you see articles in the media about how little, the obvious things like how little children go outdoors anymore, or the incredible problem of childhood obesity, which is very closely related, which is a sort of a medical expression, a medical symptom of the kind of problem I'm trying to bring attention to. There's a lot of stuff out there now about that and so on. So I'm glad that we're starting to notice, but I'm not impressed. I mean, I still think most of the trends are still, in terms of children and their inner wildness, they're still heading in the wrong direction.
So I'm really glad you brought up the birthing process, or giving birth, right? Because this wasn't something that occurred to me until I really, you mentioned it several times in the book, and it does two things for me. One of which is it kind of provides an example that I hadn't thought of before, of the degree to which fear leads to a control or a set of processes that actually end up leading to potentially an arguably worse conclusion than if more childbirth were natural. But also it's kind of this constant reminder of the degree to which this isn't just a youth problem, this is also an adult society issue, right?
Absolutely. I mean, that's where you look for the origins, certainly.
Because it may surprise people to make this connection with childbirth, can you just describe briefly sort of what's happened with childbirth and how that's a parallel, sort of based on fear and then sort of these methods of control?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great little example. I mean, it's almost a template that just keeps repeating itself through every stage of childhood thereafter. But so what happens with birth is, because of our, and this is, I'm going to have to resort to a whole lot of oversimplifications and generalizations here because we don't have much time, but because we're so risk-oriented now, and especially the medical profession is completely risk-oriented, and it's all about preventing every possible risk. And reducing every possible risk. It's a fear-driven process. When most women go to the hospital, they're in labor, they give themselves over to this, medical model, which then sets, then has the goal of, preventing every 1 in a million bad thing from happening. And women, unfortunately, then just sort of give themselves over to that process. And they get hooked up to monitors, and they're given medications and whatever, and they just give themselves up. And long story short, the impact that has, I mean, it has a lot of impacts on the mother, for one thing. She's completely giving up her own instincts and her own autonomy, and the kinds of things that my wife as a midwife is completely try to engage the mother, and my wife knows that the mother herself has all the wisdom she needs to guide the process and control the process, assuming it's a normal pregnancy. There's nothing going wrong. But as far as the child goes, the baby, the newborn, if they're born in the hospital under these conditions, and their mother's probably been heavily medicated, or at least mildly medicated, and then the baby's taken away from.
So it looks like Chris had a bandwidth issue and got logged off. Peggy's indicated she had trouble logging into that, so it may not have been Chris's fault. I'm sure he'll log back on. While he's gone, I'm going to describe this a little because it's interesting. This is a theme that comes out through the book, the childbirth theme, which was a surprise to me. I didn't expect it in this particular book or in this line of thinking. But essentially, for all the precautions we take and the interventions, we have still some of the worst mortality rates in the industrialized world in the United States. And the connection being that because the fear and the being risk averse drives us in a certain direction, we end up getting the opposite result than the one we want. So while we wait for Chris to come back, has anybody in the chat actually read the book? we're going to get more into some of the things that I think are specific to how we have taken away childhood. That Chris is back, so let's get Chris back as a moderator. Chris, you should be able to turn your mic on. Your internet connection dropped or something happened, but we think we have you back now. Just click on that talk button again at the top left.
Oh, I had to get the talk button. Hello?
You are. You're
Hello?
back.
I didn't know to hit the talk button. I mean, we were gone for a while, but now I got to hit that talk. So here, I'm back.
Okay, so that was really mentally challenging in a good way for me to kind of make those connections. The other way in which, not just the sort of the risk-averse nature of childbirth, and then the sort of the ending results for it and the connection with adults being in the same kind of a culture. The other one that occurred to me that childbirth also seems to reflect or represent are the degree to which financial interests end up driving the system. Is that fair as well?
Yeah, I think so. It's not simple. There's no sort of linear way to explain the whole thing, but it's definitely a factor.
Well, certainly medical solutions that don't involve a profit are often not the ones first promoted, right? Because the system is driven based on revenue and cash flow and the like. And I'm assuming that hospitals, doctors, and the like don't make as much money through midwifery or natural birth practices. And we don't have to dwell on this, but it was interesting to me.
Yeah. But I just think the main thing is the fear. Because then you've got hospitals don't want to get sued, so they're going to take every possible precaution to make sure nothing goes wrong. And what that whole process does is it just takes the control away from the mother. The mother gives up her control over her own birth process and turns it over to this medical model, and it doesn't always end well. Or the baby loses out. There are just certain key things that then the baby loses out on. And then I think you just see that pattern repeating itself. The same thing tends to happen with education. Parents, and again, I'm generalizing, but so many parents just turn their children over to school. At age whatever, it's time to go to school. The children go to school. And again, the educational model is very similar to the medical model. It's very control-oriented. The educational model isn't based on this idea that the children themselves know what they need, that they have this inner direction, they have this inner drive to find the experiences and the challenges that they need to learn what they need to learn. The standard educational model says, no, kids don't know anything. And we need to educate them. Here's this curriculum. Here's this plan. And kids, we got to move kids through this plan so they get the education that they're supposed to have. Do you see? It's the same. It's deja vu all over again, as Yogi Berra used to say.
So how do you help parents, especially, and maybe you can talk a little bit about the Albany Free School in this regard, overcome those fears? Like, I can tell you rationally the likelihood of my child getting abducted is extremely low, but I still have difficulty letting her go out and do something independently. How do I overcome that tendency to use the opportunity to control?
I think each of us just has to become aware of that tendency. We have to understand that we're all being so driven these days by the perception of fear, and it's nobody's fault. There's no conspiracy. It's more than anything, it's just the media. It's the 24/7 media. When something bad happens to one person anywhere on Earth, within minutes, we all know what happened. And it didn't used to be that way. We didn't always used to know. Back in the 50s and the 60s, whatever, you go back far enough, and bad news traveled very slowly. and we weren't aware of all the terrible things that were happening to this person or that person around the planet. But anyway, now we are. And so the fear is very understandable. It's probably inevitable. But at the same time, we're all conscious beings, and we can become aware that there's this perception of fear because we hear about something bad happening to a child in California, a child being kidnapped or whatever, and we can consciously say, okay, but that was like, the chances of that happening to my child, that whole thing of, it's the same thing. You have to go through that when you get onto an airplane, and you have to say to yourself, well, okay, it would be more dangerous crossing the street, crossing Main Street right now. I'm taking less of a risk than, the odds are greater that I'm going to get hit by a bus crossing Main Street in my hometown than the odds are of this plane crashing. I mean, we say these things otherwise we wouldn't get on airplanes. So I think parents have to do the same thing regarding parenting. And it's tough because it's our children, and the biological instinct that, that's evolution has so deeply, woven into us to protect our children at all costs. It's powerful, but it's still possible. We just have to, this is anything. We say, now, wait a minute. Yes, there's this perception, but the truth is, I live in a safe neighborhood. My child is a smart kid. You just have to take that leap of faith and still trust that you can let your child out of your sight and go off to a friend's house or ride their bike across wherever, and know that it's going to be okay. It's just harder, I'm not saying it's not a greater challenge than it was when I was a child. My mother didn't think twice about letting me, whatever. But it's still possible. The world hasn't changed, in other words. It's just our perception has changed. And so the challenge is greater for parents to take a deep breath and really think it through and let their kids go. Let them go out and explore the world and have their own experiences. Let them take reasonable risks.
So let's talk about what some of those things would be. So what were some of the things you really wanted to make sure what were the opportunities or environments you wanted to make sure you provided for youth at the Albany Free School?
We're an urban school, so a particularly key area was making sure kids got a chance to get out into nature. And I think that's becoming more and more important for all urban children. That I think the connection with nature, and that's where the inner wildness thing, you see, I was trying to draw that analogy between inner wildness and outer wildness, and the importance of them being connected, and outer wildness feeding inner wildness. It's just so important for children to be in nature as much as possible and to have an experience of real nature and not just the Nature Channel. You know what I mean? Kids need to be outdoors. If possible, they need to be in the forest. They need to be in truly natural surroundings. If the best one can do is the city park, where there are just squirrels and birds and whatever. I mean, that's not bad either, because there's still dirt to dig in and worms and there's lots of good stuff in any good city park. But that contact with nature is big, and then underlying all of it, we just believe that it's important for children to have the sense that they're in charge of their own lives, that they in fact know what they need, and that they know how to go in the direction of what they need. That they are their own experts, that they have the way I put it in the book is that children have their own, and again, the Greeks had this very same idea, that children have their own inner guidance system that works incredibly well most of the time, given the opportunity, given a chance to exert, to practice, to use it. But again, is what I'm saying, what's happening with modern childhood, and this is not news anymore. So many children's lives are so managed. Every minute of so many children's lives they're already spoken for. There are very few minutes in a child's day where the child is deciding, well, what do I do now? And what do I do next? And those decisions are being made for them.
Would you quote at some length G. Stanley Hall in the book, whom I was not familiar with prior to reading it, but this idea that the transition from youth to adulthood is valuable and important, but this mistaken belief that predictability and routine would make that easier, right? That it was somehow a better way to go. And then you have this great quote from Ida LeShan, I don't know if I'm saying her name right, where, the genuine growth requires failure. So, it's a mistake to do that kind of planning. So when you say you wanted to make sure the kids knew that they were sort of in charge of their own lives, that doesn't mean they're not going to make mistakes, right?
Right. They have to make, but we learn from mistakes. Evolution learns from its own mistakes. I mean, that's probably the most primary learning mechanism of all. Making mistakes and then learning. Yeah. Children need to be able to make mistakes. Mistakes are okay. Mistakes are healthy. Mistakes are necessary. Yeah, and we just so little, the children have so little opportunity. Everything is so managed. Children just don't have that many opportunities to learn from their mistakes and learn on their own terms. I drew that analogy. I went into this, children in sports, and the whole reality nowadays where children don't play sports on their own anymore. They only play organized sports which are fine. I mean, I played organized. Organized sports are wonderful, but they only play Little League baseball. And then there are coaches. And then as soon as then these coaches are constantly telling the kids what to do. And if they even start to make a mistake, then the coach just jumps right in and says, no, you got to do it this way. This is how you do it. And the child has it wasn't like when I was a child and we just played baseball on our own. And yeah, we made all kinds of mistakes. We dropped the ball, we didn't hit it, whatever. But we just kept playing. And we learned, we just day by day we learned to correct the mistakes we were making. And we learned on our own. And it doesn't mean it doesn't invalidate having a coach come and point out to you, no, this is a better way to do this. This is a better way to catch the ball, or this is a better way to hit the ball. That's a very valid thing. But if the child or the person has no innate ability to learn on their own, I would even say then that the it gets in the way of the coaching process. There's going to be first things first. Each one of us we need to learn how to, we need to learn how to learn. That fundamental mechanism, and it's not a mechanism, but that fundamental process has to be fluid. It has to be, really well oiled and working. And then the add-on of teaching or coaching or getting input from the outside, then that's great. Then you're off to the races. But if you as the individual haven't laid down your own foundation first, it kind of invalidates the help you're going to get from outside. I don't know, does that make sense? I get a little bit too...
It all makes sense to me, but again, we're introducing the audience. So you tell briefly the story of Henry David Thoreau and his short tenure at a grammar school because the parents felt he was too lax and needed to be exerting more discipline. And this is from the 1800s, and I thought, this is this sort of thoughtful approach that you're bringing us to and thinking about youth independence and self-direction and agency and their sense of making their own decisions feels like very much an age-old story. And one of the things that we've talked about on the show before is the degree to which more thoughtful narratives or understandings typically don't tend to become the mainstream because they're not simple. And obviously Albany Free School and many other schools have provided a variety of forms of sort of student independence. Is it the case that this will always just be a secondary narrative, or can you see a way in which a culture or society could actually adopt the deeper thinking here as the primary way of thinking about education?
Yeah, there's always hope, and I won't ever stop hoping. But the cards are so, the deck is so stacked. We're all just, this is back to my whole reason for writing the book. Most of us are just so programmed toward, dependency, and from the very beginning, it's just so tough. There's very little in the society at large that supports, sort of genuine autonomy. I want to be more optimistic, but I'm getting too old at this point, and I've seen too much, and I think the hope, there are plenty of hopeful. You look at the homeschooling movement, and the fact that the number of homeschoolers is actually continuing to rise, even though the birth rate at this point is declining. So that's a pretty. There are apparently over. It's hard to count homeschoolers, but there are well over 2 million homeschoolers in this country, and the number is growing, even though the number of school-age children in the country is starting to decline because the birth rate has leveled off and is starting to drop. So that's there's a lot of families, and a growing number of families in the country that are looking at the educational process and saying, no, wait a minute, we're not just going to turn our kids over to the school system and let whatever happens. No, we're gonna take control of this process ourselves as a family, and so on. So I don't want to get too negative or too cynical. There are a lot of hopeful things that are happening all the time.
Chris, it felt to me like there was a little bit of a tension in the book. And the Ann Dillard story brought it out for me in one regard. So this was about her growing up and sort of working on things and interests of her own, and her parents appearing to sort of purposely choose not to get too involved so that she would not be constrained to only be thinking or working on things that got their approval or their interest. At the same time, I felt emotionally like that story was a little bit of, it was hard not to feel like the parents were indifferent or unsupportive. And so it felt like to me like there is this tension between freedom and support. And how do you balance that?
Yeah. Now, a lot of people, there's a real generational divide there. When I go around and give talks and so on, younger generations of parents, they have a hard time with that. They see Annie Dillard's depiction of parenthood as a description of her parents as her parents being, too distant, too uninvolved, and that's very interesting. Parenting, like everything else, parenting evolves, and nowadays parents are way more, or many parents are way more involved with their children than in my generation. It's been a pretty marked shift, between the last two generations. So, I just, and it's not up to me to tell any parent how they should dance the dance of parenting. But I'm actually writing an article right now for an English magazine. It's called The Mother, and I'm calling the article "Over-Attachment Parenting," because I see in some cases where parents, out of that desire, out of that reaction to not have, realizing they weren't close enough to their parents when they were children, They've kind of, the way it so often happens, we bounce to the other extreme, at least for a while. And now we've got too many parents that they're over-attached, that they've made children too much the center of their attention. They've gotten too involved in their parents. And that's what I think Annie Dillard was trying to say, is that she didn't need her parents to validate her experience. Her experience was hers. And she was even grateful that her parents didn't, kind of step over her boundary and get involved, and start kind of living through her experience. They were respectful of her experience being her experience. I thought it was a very important point. But I recognize that that's really hard for people today, especially young parents. It just doesn't, they don't see it that way. They see it as too much distance.
Chris, is there an additional complexity here that some personalities are going to respond to that independence differently than others?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's definitely another of the many layers. I mean, these are very complex things we're talking about. It's hard to, I'm just going to make trouble in this little bit of an hour that we have here. Because it's complex. Well, it's just very layered, complex stuff. Not simple at all.
Well, we're going to try and get a little bit of simplicity here. There's a lot that we're probably not going to have time to cover. It's so worth reading this book. And the chapter on solitude for me was incredibly moving. We're probably not going to get a chance to talk too much about technology, but we got a question in the chat from Lori about sort of practical applications or things that teachers could do. And I know you're not oversimplifying, but you do give some steps, especially that parents can take in the book. If we were to kind of brainstorm now things that teachers could do who are not at a free school or a democratic school or an alternative school, could we produce a list of things they could be thinking about or working on?
Sure. I mean, I think, again, I haven't, I can only go so far here because I have never taught in a conventional setting. I've spent 40 years teaching, sort of outside of the system. So I can't speak from experience. I in a certain way, I regret that. I think it's only when we can speak. It's only when we can speak from experience that we can speak with any real authority. I mean, that's what I believe. But at any rate, I know teachers, that are in conventional settings, and I know they're able to do really pretty amazing things sometimes. If at least they're in a good enough situation where they have a little freedom and a little autonomy, and nobody's just breathing right down there. So yeah, there's things teachers can do. It's little things or big things.
We start with homework.
I just think introducing as much choice as possible in whatever given situation a teacher is in. There's always room to introduce some choice. Always some. And let kids themselves decide that you can you can turn your classroom pretty quietly. You can turn your classroom into a little sort of democratic community. You can get the kids together, once a day or once a week or whatever. There's always a point where you can get the kids together and say, okay, let's talk about things. Let's talk about how it's going, or you can begin the year with, well, what kind of rules do you think let's make some rules. Let's make some rules for our room. Let's together decide the kind of rules we need to have this be a good place and be a safe place and that's actually a huge step to take, and that doesn't mean that the teacher isn't giving away his or her authority. The teacher's still in control, and the kids will still know the teacher's in control, but it's a huge step to say to the children, okay, we're all in this together, and this is your little community, and how do you want it to be? And what ideas do you have for this being, a good, happy place where everybody's getting what they want? That's powerful, and I know teachers that do that, and they have to keep it local, obviously, just within their own classroom. They're not going to change the rules of the school or any other thing, but It's pretty profound. The teachers can help with, they can take care of conflicts in that same way. They can just bring the kids together instead of just sending the child out and go to the principal or whatever. If two kids get into a fight or an argument or something, there are points in the day where the teacher can pull the kids together and say, well, let's talk about what happened. And they can have a little session. There's still room, at least in some schools. There's enough room in the day where they're not having to just keep teaching to the test to do that. And teachers can still get kids outside of the school. There's still money in some schools, at least. There's a budget for taking field trips, for going places, for getting out into nature.
So I wrote down
bringing the arts in as much as possible, and enabling kids to be creative and handle the curriculum in a creative way that's imaginative, that involves art as much as it's just filling out worksheets. All those things are very possible, and each one of them is very important.
Yeah, I wrote down less homework, time for thinking. Right. Again, my love of that solitude chapter. Getting outdoors, like you had said. Peggy says different homework.
Yeah, if teachers can get away with less homework, I don't know how much freedom they have anymore on that score, but I just don't. That's where I just don't know. But yeah, if they can pull that off, definitely less.
And then my number one here was this huge point that you make toward the end of the book about paying attention to our own inner wildness.
Absolutely. I'm about to go up to a really nice progressive school in Maine and do a day-long workshop with the faculty, and they've read the book, and I don't need to. That's a school where kids get to go outside and they get to play, and it's a private school, so they're not bound. Teachers aren't just teaching to the test all day. Teachers are able to be quite creative, and the school's out in the country, so they have a beautiful campus they're not far from the ocean, so I don't need to convince them that they pretty much, I'm preaching to the converted as far as the basic ideas in the book about childhood, but I want to spend the day with them talking about what are they doing to nurture their own inner wildness, and are they doing enough, and are they paying attention to that? And because I think that's still, especially people in the helping professions. This isn't new, but those of us in the helping professions, have a strong predisposition to not taking care of ourselves. Right? We're so busy taking care of someone else. We're so busy being a good teacher or a good doctor or a good minister or a good nurse or whatever that we ignore ourselves and we don't nurture ourselves. And of course, in this case, I would say we don't nurture our own inner wildness. We don't spend enough time in nature, or we don't spend enough time living in an imaginative way, or expressing ourselves creatively, or whatever, because we're too damn busy teaching and whatever else we're doing. We inadvertently end up ignoring ourselves. So yeah, it's huge, and I would always talk to parents. That was always a topic of conversation when I was at the schools with parents. Was, so what are you doing to take care of yourself? I know you're a great parent and whatever. And so how about you? How are you doing? That was so important to cover that ground and have that conversation. But with teachers, it's key. I mean, I always say that the bottom line of teaching is a teacher can't take a child any farther than the teacher has taken him or herself. Right? So, very important that teachers take care of their own inner wellness.
It seems like that's both an opportunity for modeling and an opportunity for truly understanding kind of how you need to be fed or helped when you are making those kinds of choices or self-directing or fulfilling yourself in those particular ways.
Yeah, totally. And I think especially with teachers. I think the danger is with teachers, if teachers aren't taking care of themselves for whatever reason, and I don't mean to judge, but if it's just true that they're not, then when they go to school and they're in the classroom and they're with their kids, there's just not much chance that they're going to have any awareness of their kids on that level. It's just so much more likely that then it's just going to become all about the curriculum and making sure the kids are ready to take the tests. And you know what I'm saying? That just sort of the life just is so much more likely. The life is just the real juice, and life is going to drain out of the process. And you know, school is just going to turn into a training session, and it's going to end up, you know, squashing the child's inner wildness for sure. So it's really important.
So we're in our last 10 minutes. If you have a question for Chris, please feel free to put it in the chat, or you can raise your virtual hand. It's the third icon over in the the participant box. It's a hand icon. You can click on that, and I'll give you the microphone. If you've put a question in the chat and I've missed it, please post it again. I apologize, but things go by fairly quickly. We can't drill down on all aspects of the technology piece in a few remaining minutes, but can you give us some sense of why technology is such a mixed bag for you?
Yeah, well, I think it's a mixed bag for children for two reasons. It definitely separates, or tends to separate, kids from each other in a physical, embodied, face-to-face way. It reduces the intimacy and immediacy of their communication. And same with nature. It just tends to keep kids indoors, and it keeps kids in front of screens. To a frightening degree at this point. I mean, the number of hours that the average child spends in front of a screen or multiple screens has just become, I don't know, it's an astronomical. I think it's over 10 hours a day at this point. If you count the multiple screens, if you add up the multiplicity of the screens. So those are my two biggest problems. There's nothing inherently wrong with the technology. There's a lot of beauty to the technology, and there's a lot of amazing aspects to electronic communication that in a sense bring people together. But that there's two ways that create a separation that I would say kind of starve our inner wildness.
And I'm giving him microphone privileges. I don't think so. So Richard, go ahead and click on the talk button at the top left, and you should be able to turn your mic on. Here we are.
Hi, Chris.
Hi.
Like to say thanks for tonight. Eons ago in the 70s, I studied a little bit with Kirschenbaum and Simon and values clarification up in J, and very, very similar things. I think what we have done, and also in terms of technology, is we've lost the connection between knowledge, studying for these tests, the facts, and context, how it fits into the human experience. Back in the old days, we learned by apprenticeship. So everything I learned, whether build a cathedral, plant a seed, was in context of dad or mom or reality. I'm teaching elementary school, by the way, the town next to Sandy Hook. And
oh, wow.
I'll have a worksheet on Venn diagrams. And of course, it doesn't relate to anything. And you can just turn to the class and say, how many people like chocolate cake? How many people like vanilla cake? And the class goes crazy. And then you ask, what's common between the two cakes, even though they're totally different? And they get it, and it's alive. But if you step off of the worksheet, now I'm doing this as a sub, doing some experimentation. you could see it unravels the teacher because they're away from, and in their fear of testing and everything else from No Rich Child Left Behind.
Right.
They're locked into the knowledge, but not into reality, how it relates to reality. The other research that's coming out of New York City from STEM is minority youth that are making it into college from STEM is not from the STEM curriculum at all. What they've learned is from the mentoring. Those teachers that teach STEM also mentor.
Right.
So we've cut out the human context in our obsession with curriculums, and the textbook people are big time, and the curriculum people are big time to blame on this.
Well, it's an educational industrial complex. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of money out there. It just goes back to,
it's the 12th century classroom. But the internet and collaboration on the internet is bypassing that.
I know. There's the whole. I mean, there's technology. It's a double edge always. There's power to do good, and there's tremendous power to do evil. It can just go either way or both ways. Right.
Thanks, Richard.
Great work.
Hey, Vinny, I've given you the microphone. Vinny, you can turn your mic on by clicking on the talk button at the top left of your screen.
Hello.
There you are.
Hello.
Hi.
Okay. Hello. Thank you, Chris, for the talk. I have a question. I'm struggling by the idea of free children. So if you could elaborate more on, because of your experiences, 35 years working with children, what is your idea about free children? If they're really, so I'm struggling the idea that are they really free, or what makes them free, and what are they free from what actually, when or the idea of freedom for children, I think, because also I have the questions when they call the free school, it's how I'm struggling the idea how ever a person be ever free, or the idea that children ever be in the situations that they are free, something like that. I hope I make sense.
I think so. I mean, there's a powerful distinction though between freedom from something, like freedom from oppression, or freedom from slavery, or freedom from a bad situation, or freedom to or toward something. And in my school, we're much more oriented in the freedom to, as opposed to freedom from. It's not, our school isn't focused on having kids be free from authority, or free from being told what to do or whatever. It just means that children are free to direct their own lives. They're free to explore. They're free to make mistakes, which Steve and I were talking about a little while ago, about how important it is for children to make mistakes and then learn from those mistakes without someone just jumping right in and either preventing them from making the mistake in the first place by completely managing their activity, or jumping in to fix it right away and say, oh no, this is what you should have done, which is what happens, like in children's sports nowadays. When children play Little League baseball, there's an adult is right there to say, oh no, this is what you did wrong, and this is the right way to do it. Let me show you. So this children just need freedom to live, to be themselves, and to figure out what their life is about. I'll get more philosophical here. Figure out why they're here. What life is really about, what their purpose is, and so on. That requires freedom. Does that make sense?
Chris, it's a delightful hour. We always finish on time as a courtesy to our guests.
Good.
The book is In Defense of Childhood, Chris Mercogliano. Thank you so much, Chris.
It was my pleasure. I'm sorry the time went so fast.
it's a good sign. Thanks for coming, Chris. Thanks, everybody, for being here. The good questions and the good chat.
Yeah,
The recording will get posted
question.
within a day. Don't miss shows coming up. Next week, Paul Thomas on poverty and the corporate takeover of America.
You have a great lineup.
Learning and
Amazing
Mindstorms.
lineup.
I'm glad you think so. Thanks again, Chris.
All right.
Delightful
Thank you,
to get
Steve.
to know you.
Good. All right.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Bye-bye.
And bye.